Hello, and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, I'm going to be digging into a topic that's been simmering quietly in a lot of kink communities globally. I've had a couple of emails about this from different locations around the world. What I'm going to be talking about today is whether individuals on the Sex Offender Registry should be allowed into our public events, and how leadership responds when the safety of the community is brought into question. And I want to say this isn't going to be an easy one, and it's not meant to be, but it is necessary that we discuss this. This conversation isn't about calling out any one person or a dungeon or a party or starting a witch hunt. That's not what I'm here to do. It's about looking at behavioral patterns, the decisions being made behind the scenes, and the consequences those decisions have for survivors or others, or for those seeking safe spaces for the community as a whole. And at the core here, this is really a conversation about safety and transparency and psychological responsibility. Because if we claim to be a consent-based culture, we have to actually behave like one when it matters most. I want to apologize a little bit. It's going to be a little bit noisy around me today. Unfortunately, it's raining. There's construction going on. Traffic's really heavy, so if you guys hear that, I'm going to do my best to kind of edit that out later. But anyways, look, before I get into all these deeper parts today, I do want to thank all of you for being here with me. The fact that more of you are joining the conversation, more of you are sending me your questions, your comments. I appreciate it. You know, whether you've been here since the beginning for 4 years ago or you're just brand new to the show, all of your support matters to me a lot. It's why I do the show. It's why I come back week after week, year after year. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you follow the show on your platform of choice. For you Spotify listeners out there, don't forget, if you could do me a favor, I really need you all to rate the show on the mobile app. You just tap the 3 little dots after you listen to the show for about 30 seconds. You hit that star rating up to 5 stars for me, right? It helps more people find the show and join these important conversations and keep the show free for now. And, you know, I can keep it growing and bring on more interesting guests here in the future. If you do want to support my work and what I do for everybody, you can find a donation link in the show notes, or you can even visit my profile on Fetlife. There's things there. Every little bit keeps these episodes going, and it makes it easier to create resources for those who need them most. All right, let's dive into this today, right? What am I actually talking about here? I want to start by laying some groundwork, because without a clear understanding of what we're actually talking about, the rest of this conversation loses a lot of weight. When we use the term registered sex offender, or here forward, RSO, we're referring to someone who, following a conviction for a sexual offense, is required to be listed on a public or private registry. These registries were originally developed as a tool for law enforcement and community awareness. The whole idea was that these certain offenses warranted ongoing monitoring, and that people had a right to know if someone within their particular, history was living in their neighborhood, working in their proximity, or attending certain community events. Now, what many people don't realize, especially those who've never worked in behavioral health, legal defense, or maybe even victim advocacy, is how wide the net is when it comes to who ends up on these registries, right? Now, I'm not advocating for anybody here. I want to make this clear. What I'm trying to do is give everybody a really big understanding of how this stuff works, because I've worked on the front end in law enforcement dealing with some of the stuff. I don't work with those individuals, but, I have colleagues who do. So I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit this right now so you get some more depth. Now, there are individuals on the registry for statutory offenses, which typically involve maybe consensual relationships where one party is technically underage and the other is not. So, they started off as boyfriend and girlfriend in high school. Maybe one was a sophomore and the other one was a freshman, whatever the case may be. And now they've one graduates, they're like 18, 19, and they're still dating that 17-year-old or sometimes 16-year-olds. And it is common enough in real life, but in many jurisdictions, it still qualifies as a crime. Now, even if both parties were emotionally connected, even if the younger person was a willing participant, the law here doesn't necessarily consider the context. On the opposite end of that spectrum is where we have those who were convicted for acts that involve violence, coercion, exploitation, repeated predatory behavior, right? These are offenses where the victim's autonomy was completely dismissed, ignored, systematically broke down, right? These are cases that often involve children, incapacitated adults, or the use of manipulation and grooming. And unfortunately, those offenses do occur in our broader world and sometimes in our communities. Now, in between the two ends of the spectrum is this whole gray area in the middle. People who download illegal material without fully understanding what they're accessing, individuals with mental illnesses who may not have fully grasped the whole implications of their interactions, right, of what they're doing. People who pled guilty to avoid a harsher sentence, even if they believe themselves to be innocent. And yes, people who do commit harm, serve time, and have since done real work to rehabilitate, but they're still listed often for life. There are some places in the U.S. and I think a couple of others that have levels or degrees. So level 1, 2, and 3, and these are based on what we call perceived risk to reoffend. A level 1 individual is generally considered a low risk. They may have committed a less severe offense. Level 2 is more of to indicate something more moderate concern, and level 3 is where it gets really problematic. These are someone who might be seen as high risk, someone with a violent history, but even these classifications are inconsistent, right? The laws vary widely from state to state, and some states don't use levels at all. There are cases where people move to a new jurisdiction and are suddenly required to register in ways they weren't before. So why does this all matter in kink? Chris, why are you talking to us about this today? Because in our spaces, our dungeons, our events, our classes, our workshops, these are all built around one key principle: consent. And consent isn't just about getting a yes, it's about it being informed and having the ability to make a decision with all of the facts. It's about emotional safety. And when someone with a known history of violating consent is brought into a space without transparency or accountability, it chips away at the very foundation of what makes our communities different from just any social gathering, right? Kink is inherently vulnerable. People are restrained, they're blindfolded, they're degraded, praised, exposed. We play with power dynamics, pain. And this whole emotional echo of our past. It's not uncommon for someone to be engaging in a scene that is connected to trauma they're actively working through. I'm not saying that everybody does, but it is a little bit more common than you think. And that's not a weakness. That's part of how kink can be healing. But that healing happens when in these environments where trust is earned and maintained. So when somebody with an RSO enters that space, especially one whose history isn't disclosed, and people find out after the fact, that betrayal is not just about their presence, it's about the denial of choice. The person had a say in attending, others didn't get to decide whether they felt safe or engaging near them. That's not just a policy failure. It's a violation of consent by omission. And this isn't about whether every person on the registry is dangerous. It's about whether the rest of the community has the right to know enough to make their own decisions, to have that autonomy and choice. Because when consent is rooted in information, and taking that information away is its own kind of harm. Now, this isn't just theoretical. It's happening now, and that's why I'm actually doing this episode. Especially in spaces where people go for safety and connection, and authenticity, and to explore their desires, which is why we need to look at what actually unfolds when those decisions are made behind closed doors and how communities respond. Because here, there is a psychological and emotional impact. We can't just deny it. We can't just roll our eyes and say, oh, great, look, Chris is bringing up a hot topic. I'm going to go and eat some popcorn. Well, go right ahead. If you want to turn your eyes to it, then that decision is yours. I'm not asking you to listen. But let's really talk about what actually happens, emotionally, socially, and psychologically. Because when someone with a known history of sexual harm is allowed into a kink event, right, this is really problematic, because it's not just about a policy. It's about the atmosphere it creates, the signal it sends, and the way it lands in the bodies of the people in that space. Now, it's easy to assume that this is only about survivors of trauma, but that's just too narrow of a scope here, even for me to look at this. Yes, people with trauma histories often feel the shift most acutely, right? They're more likely to pick up on the subtle cues of danger, more likely to check out emotionally or physically when something feels off. But that impact doesn't end there. Everyone in that room will be affected, because safety in these spaces is collective, right? Dominants who rely on trust and mutual vulnerability to facilitate scenes that we're doing may suddenly find themselves feeling unsure about who else is present. Submissives may hesitate to engage, not because they're not interested, but because they don't know if the people watching or the people they might negotiate with later are safe. Switches here, who often observe first and decide whether they're safe enough to step into a role, might feel like they're walking into something murky, not empowering. And if you're a newcomer, people who've never experienced a trauma in maybe a personal sense, they can feel it. They might not have to, they might not have the language to describe it, but they know something feels off. The room is heavy, the interactions become more cautious, play becomes more muted, because no one knows where the boundaries are anymore or who's making the calls. And it's not about creating a space where no one has a past. It's about making sure that the past doesn't get to quietly rewrite the expectations of safety for everyone else. Now, I had somebody from a local community once tell me that their dungeon monitor, their DM, didn't understand why people stopped showing up. Attendance started to drop. The DM just was like, man, I don't get it. But quietly, what had happened was the community learned that somebody that was attending had an RSO status, and they had been not only allowed to attend one event, but multiple events and multiple scenes, and there was no disclosure, there was no conversation. They were just there. And instead of confronting it, people left. They didn't do this to punish them, to punish the dungeon or punish the DM, and it wasn't about stirring up drama. They left to protect themselves, right? And that is not community drama. That's a survival instinct. It's a sign that something foundational was no longer trusted. And this is where we need to understand the psychology of what I call the silent exit. People don't always make noise when they feel unsafe. They disappear, they ghost, they stop replying to invites. They don't do it because they do this because they no longer feel secure enough to stay, not because they want to cancel anyone, not because they don't believe in second chances, but because they don't trust that their safety is being taken seriously. And you can't overlook that. This isn't about being overly sensitive. It's a reflection of something bigger. When consent culture stops being a lived reality and starts becoming just another buzzword. And that discomfort doesn't belong to one group. It lives in the air of the entire room. And when one person's presence changes the mood, the energy, and the way others participate, we're no longer operating in a space built on trust. We're just pretending to. And what we're left with is a room full of people who are second-guessing themselves, looking over their shoulders, or disengaging with one another. And that all costs us more than one person's attendance. It costs the community its credibility. So no, this isn't just about trauma survivors. It's about everyone who walks into that space with the belief that the organizers have their backs, that if something feels wrong, someone's going to notice. That the people in charge are not just checking IDs and inspecting floggers, but paying attention to the emotional and psychological tone of the entire room. And when that trust is gone, people don't usually fight for it. They just leave. And often, they don't come back. And, let's talk about next what happens when leadership makes it worse. Not to mention, taking the victim stance, but making bad decision after bad decision, right? But they don't take any responsibility for their actions. And this is where this whole, weaponization of victimhood comes in. Because when we talk about what breaks trust in the community, it's not just about, the initial decision that causes damage. It's about how leadership responds, and especially when they're questioned. And my God, all I'm seeing lately are issues with all these groups where there's problems and they are, oh, I'm so sorry, and we didn't acknowledge it. You know what? You people honestly shouldn't be in charge. You shouldn't have a group, because if violations are happening that frequently in your spaces, not just with the topic I am today, I am talking about in general, you shouldn't be in charge. Your ability to make a decision, you are proving to everybody you're not capable. And that's the end of that discussion. You don't have the capability to make decisions for others. And I don't have the emotional bandwidth to keep harping on that, but I'm going to keep going here because I just find these placated, functioning style, these cookie cutter responses and apologies ridiculous. One of the most common behaviors I've seen across kink spaces, nonprofits, and even some of the therapy circles that I inhabit is this pattern where a leader, when challenged, makes the moment all about themselves. Instead of owning the impact of what happened, they shift the spotlight, right? They talk about how they feel attacked, how the community's turned on them, how hard it is to be in charge. And what was originally a conversation about safety and ethics and responsibility becomes a performance about being mistreated. And my God, I've seen this from the UK to the United States to Australia to Singapore to Korea to places in between, because it's not uncommon. And we just keep allowing it as a community. Demand change. Have somebody step down. They can't do it. You know, at the beginning of this year, I talked about what happened in Florida. My God, that guy shouldn't be allowed near any space. Neither should any of those people ever again. I'm not one for saying that we can't eventually learn to forgive. Forgiveness is very key in the emotional process. But they have proven that these people cannot be trusted, and that they shouldn't really be a part of the community. That's a personal thing I've seen, because I'm not going to go into that because I spoke about that early in the year, but I read those apologies, and that was the same thing. Those apologies were a joke. There was nothing there, but you can go and listen to that. That was episode 1 of season 4. Nevertheless, right? But when I see people do all of this, when I see all of these behaviors, and I see this, conversations about how everything's changed and the focus becomes about them, this is something I refer to as what we call emotional hijacking. It's a tendency to center on one's own emotional discomfort in response to being held accountable. And it shows up in some very predictable ways. Statements that aren't really statements, long posts or speeches that emphasize how no one sees the full picture, or, how they've been trying their best, or how people should have come to them privately instead of stirring up drama. These aren't transparent reflections. They're subtle forms of deflection. And what drives this? Well, you know what? A lot of things drive this. It's shame, deep unresolved conflict internally. They're worried about being wrong, being exposed, being publicly criticized, right? And instead of processing that shame and turning into a reflection of growth, it gets weaponized into defensiveness. My God, all over, up and down the West Coast of the United States, Oregon, it happens, Washington State, you all got some serious problems up in that part of the country, and you all just keep letting it happen, right? They talk about accountability, but there is none. So your best choice is to protect yourselves, is not to go. Maybe that's when they'll get it. But when they weaponize this into defensiveness, it's easier for them to play the role of the misunderstood leader than ask, did I make a call that harmed people? Because that would require vulnerability. It would require stepping out of the ego and into responsibility. Then there's this whole fear of losing status, of losing control when someone's identity is wrapped up in their role as maybe the owner or community founder or well-known educator. And my God, I'm kind of I don't get tired of trying to tell you all and if I put up a status about warning you, there is a problem. Because I see the same behavioral patterns in people and they keep repeating it, right? But we allow these things to happen. And when all of these people start going, all of these educators and founders and DMs say, it can feel threatening to admit they got something wrong. But, the bottom line is instead they want to protect their image. And that becomes the cost of that is at the community's entire well-being. And they will use Darvo tactics, destroy people, belittle people, destroy their reputation. They don't care because they were wrong and they don't want to be called out. Now, sometimes the behavior isn't always malicious. It's often unconscious, but that doesn't make it harmless. In fact, it's deeply harmful because it flips the dynamic. Instead of focusing on, those who felt unsafe or betrayed, the community is now being asked to comfort the leader, take care of them, to reassure them, to soothe their feelings. And that's not leadership, that's fragility in disguise. I saw this over in Europe, I don't know, sometime last year. And I read this thing that was like this plus 25-minute manifesto, how nothing was their fault. Sorry, I don't agree. I couldn't even get past the first paragraph. They accepted no responsibility. Right? Accountability is not cruelty. Being asked to answer for your choices isn't the same as being attacked. But when someone responds to concern by flooding it into victimhood, they avoid the very thing they need to confront. That leadership isn't about being liked. It's about being responsible. It's about making hard choices, listening to when people speak up, and holding space for discomfort without turning it into a sympathy grab. We do this in the military, right? We have to make hard choices when we're leaders. We have to be responsible for those in our command. Not everybody's going to like it, but we do it for that reason. We're not doing it to protect ourselves. But here's the most important part of all of this. When leaders do this, when they center themselves in the moments of collective hurt, they teach the community that honesty isn't safe, that critique will be punished with guilt trips, that the only acceptable response is silence or praise. And once that becomes that whole unspoken rule, Florida, right? Washington, Oregon, Belgium, UK, Sydney, Melbourne. I'm rattling off cities where this is consistently happening. Trust erodes fast. A healthy space doesn't demand perfection from its leaders, but it does expect integrity. And if you make a decision that causes people to feel unsafe, and they tell you your job is not to argue, it's to listen, your role isn't to defend your image. It's to repair the damage. And that can't happen if your first move is to make the whole situation about how hard this is for you. Then you shouldn't have been there in the first place. So let's stop confusing discomfort with persecution. Let's start asking better questions and what kind of leadership actually protects the values we care about, at least that we say we care about, right? Now, I want to talk about how communities can respond to all of this, right? What you can do, because at the center of this entire conversation is one question. Can people truly give informed consent if they don't know who they're sharing space with? Now, we talk about consent often in terms of negotiation between two people. What are our limits? What's your safe word? But that's just one layer, right? In public spaces and dungeons and party events, consent isn't just about what happens on a bench or a mat. It's about what people believe they're stepping into when they walk through the door, the environment, the expectations, the shared trust that organizers have done their due diligence. When someone with a history of harm is allowed in without transparency, when attendees aren't given the chance to decide for themselves what they're comfortable with, that's not just leadership. That's not a leadership decision, right? That's a consent violation on the community level. Because we remove somebody's ability to make an informed choice. We've removed their autonomy. And that's the very thing we claim to value the most. Now, to be clear, not all offenses are the same. A 19-year-old who was dating a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old is not the same as someone who spent years grooming and coercing people into unsafe situations. But when we talk about gray areas, we need to be careful we don't use that as an excuse to avoid accountability. Because when we default, when the default here is silence, we're not giving people a choice. We're hoping they just won't notice. And transparency doesn't mean public shaming. It doesn't mean banishment or treating people as irredeemable. What it does mean is clarity. It means stop pretending these situations are rare or that avoiding discomfort is the same as maintaining peace. Vetting isn't about gatekeeping. It's about honesty. It's about courage. It's about saying, here's what we know, and here's how we're handling it. If we can't do that, We're not building consent-based spaces. We're creating and curating illusions for everybody to make a buck or get our rocks off. This is where we need to ask really hard questions. Are we building inclusive spaces, or are we building safe ones? Can we do both? And if we can't, who are we prioritizing when those values come into conflict? These aren't rhetorical questions I'm asking. These are choices that are being made every time an organizer says yes or no to someone's presence. Every time a DM looks the other way, every time a community defaults to silence because, the conversations are too difficult, that's going to become a bigger problem. So what can we actually do? Well, if you're a DM, you're an organizer, you're a community leader, and I don't put a lot of stock in these people, right? This is where you can step up. First, maybe adopt a trauma-aware practice, when shaping some of your policies. This doesn't mean turning your, I don't want you to create you or your other people that are volunteering into therapists, because you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. But it does mean recognizing that, that people experience and respond to harm differently. You need to build a policy that acknowledges that not everyone's going to speak up right away, and to train your staff to recognize when someone might be distressed, even if they're not making a formal complaint. You need to, and here's the big one, people, you need to apply these policies consistently. You're not just picking one person here and, oh, that person's okay, but this person over here. This is not about popularity. It's not based on how long someone's been around. And it's definitely not based on your personal comfort level. And finally, you need to plan events with survivor safety in mind. It doesn't mean asking people to disclose their trauma, but it does mean being proactive about the emotional tone of your space. Because consider how your choices affect the most vulnerable people in the room, not just the most vocal. And above all, you need to listen. Pay attention to who stops coming, not just who keeps showing up. Silence isn't always consent. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. We don't have to build perfect spaces, but we do need to build responsible ones. Ones where consent is more than just a word. It's something we protect through transparency, through policies, and through a community that's willing to have hard conversations. Before these registries existed, I listened to stories from the people that I learned from all those, decades ago, about what they did and how they trusted and how they vetted. That's why there wasn't a lot of public scenes. They played in private and everybody knew, because it was really about being safe. It was about exploring together and protecting what we did, but being safe. Now we're throwing swinger parties with sex and drinking, and I'm probably going to go into that one next week. We're just letting anyone in. But you're not realizing what you're doing. And then we just default. And I'm kind of getting tired of the excuses, because that's what you're putting up. And part of this is maybe a call out, but part of this is understanding that if you can't be trusted in the community and you take that leadership position, don't start questioning why people don't come around. Because then the only thing you have to do is look in the mirror and you'll figure out why. Because you lied to them. Because someone in, attendance was a predator or was harmful, and they no longer feel safe or can trust your judgment. Look, this conversation today isn't about one person. It's not about one party or one bad decision. It's about who we are when no one's watching. It's about how we handle safety when it's complicated. It's about what it means to hold a space, not just for pleasure, but for protection. Because if our communities are built on consent, on trust, on our shared vulnerability, desires, and fantasies, then we can't turn away from these questions just because they're uncomfortable. We have to be willing to ask them. We have to be willing to sit with them. And we have to act on the answers. And I'll be honest, for me personally, I believe there are some places where a person with a known history of sexual harm should not be. That's not coming from fear. It's coming from respect for what these spaces are meant to be and for the people in them who deserve to feel safe without having to justify why. But I also know this is a hard conversation, and it's not just mine alone. So I'm going to leave you all with one question as I wrap up the show today. Who gets to feel safe first? Because whether we say it out loud or not, our decisions answer that question every time. Now, if you've got some thoughts on this episode today, I know it's going to be a little bit charged. You want to share that experience navigating maybe what's happened in a scene you've been a part of, feel free to reach out. Let me know on socials, on Fetlife or Substack. Get a hold of me on Gmail, Twitter, X, Instagram. My God, I have to keep track of it all, right? And through, if you need to really talk about this and you can reach out to me through my website. I just want you all to know that this wasn't an easy conversation for me to have today, more so because I think it's going to stir a lot of mixed feelings, right? And I know there's going to be some out there who are going to say, they've been on it because of, they urinated in a playground. And trust me, that's actually something that gets people put on registries, and that was their offense. Maybe they don't feel comfortable about that. But I would be more comfortable about having that conversation than having somebody just found out you were on a list and you didn't say anything and letting their imagination run wild, right? I know this is a tough conversation, so let me know what's, in your thoughts about this. I'm going to place the question up for you. I do want to let you all know, because of the ongoing support from a really good friend of mine, I do have a book out there. It's called Tangled Desires, The Intersection Between BDSM and Psychology. Look, it's a little bit repetitive. It's my first book. Tough for me to write, but it's out there wherever you can download your ebooks, or if you want to get a hard copy, there is a link on my profile. I've got some next week. I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to come back to another discussion I just touched based on earlier. Unless something else comes to the forefront, I'm going to be talking about alcohol consumption at kink events again and in dungeon spaces. I'm going to tell you right now, that's going to be very charged for me, because the moment you drink, you remove consent, but we're going to dive into all of that next week. Can't believe it's still going on, but apparently now events, I can understand in different cultures where Europe is a little bit more laxed on things, but so far I've not read one country that has one law that doesn't say the moment that you drink, you don't give up consent, and people seem not to really understand that. I don't know why we're doing it in this space, especially inside of the United States, but whatever. You want to add more complications, potentially lawsuits. I just think it's a matter of time, but what would I know, right? I just deal in human behavior. All right, so let me know what you think in the thoughts and comments below. And again, if you do follow me, please don't forget to, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Find me on Substack. I'm now there too. I'm starting to migrate, and I'm putting up new writings that are exclusively for people who subscribe to my Substack that you're not going to find anywhere else. So if you'd like, you can find me there at Enhanced Mind Substack. That will be in the show's description. You can find me there. Until next time, everybody. Be safe and stay kinky.